Get ready for a clash of titans. It's Jan-Christoph Duda versus the young phenom Praggnanandhaa in a high-stakes blitz battle. This is going to be fast and furious, and we're off with a classic Italian game. Both players develop their pieces to the most natural squares, building a solid foundation in the center. It's textbook, picture-perfect chess. The position remains calm as both sides maneuver for position. Pieces are shuffled to better squares, with Black's knight making an interesting journey out to the h5 square. The tension finally starts to build. Knights from both sides are swarming towards the critical d5 square. This is the key battleground, and a clash feels inevitable, and Pragg strikes first, with knight takes knight on d5. A fantastic decision, and the only move to completely neutralize White's pressure. The point is this: after White recaptures with the bishop, the Black knight calmly drops back to e7. If White pushes the pawn to d4, Black secures the king side with pawn to h6, and it's perfectly equal. Duda recaptures with the pawn. Black's knight reroutes to e7, and now Duda immediately challenges the center with the pawn push to d4. But here, Pragg plays the quiet pawn to h6, and this is a slight inaccuracy. It gives away the advantage. Much stronger was the active bishop to g4, putting immediate pressure on White's f3 knight and challenging for control of the center. But Duda returns the favor immediately. Rook to e1 is also an inaccuracy, missing a golden opportunity. White should have played pawn takes pawn on e5 right away, which would have put Black under serious pressure. Instead, this move lets Pragg right back in, and Pragg seizes his chance, capturing on d4. A series of exchanges follows, and after both sides complete their development, the game settles into a very balanced and complex middle game. Now begins a dance of the heavy pieces. Rooks slide back and forth, improving their positions. Black's bishop makes a brief sortie to g4, and eventually Pragg's rook lands actively on the e5 square. Pragg cashes in, with his rook taking the pawn on di5, but Duda is not sitting idly by. He generates powerful counterplay, and his bishop goes on a rampage, gobbling up pawns on b7 and a6. Black pushes a pawn to dive, trying to reclaim the center. Duda calmly improves his bishop to d3, and the stage is set for fireworks. And here, under pressure, Pragg makes a risky decision. There was a much safer path forward. The better defensive idea was rook to e7, a solid move. After pawn to b4, Black could push the d-pawn to d4, the pawns get traded, and the position is still very much a game. But in the game, Pragg leaps into the fire with knight to h4, and this gives White a real chance to take over. Duda prepares with bishop to f2, and Pragg pulls the trigger. He plays knight takes the pawn on f3 with check, a sacrifice to open up the white king, and Duda correctly accepts. Pawn takes knight on f3 is the best move, and the only one to keep the advantage. He's calculated that he can handle the follow-up attack. Black follows through with rook to g5. Check! Wow! Bishop to g3 from Duda. A brilliant move. He's willing to give up the bishop to completely shut down Black's attack. And here's the beautiful idea. If Black checks with the pawn to c4, the knight jumps to d4. The bishop takes the knight on d4 with check, the pawn recaptures, and White's king is safe, and the attack is decisive. Pragg captures with rook takes rook on e2, but this is an inaccuracy, missing his last real chance to create chaos. The critical move was pawn to c4 with check. This forces the knight to d4. Bishop takes the knight on d4, check, pawn recaptures. And now rook takes the bishop on g3 with check, creating maximum problems. Instead, in the game, Pragg plays rook takes rook on e2, and this simplifies White's task, and Duda is precise. Bishop takes the rook on e2 is the only move that keeps his large winning advantage. Pragg is struggling to defend, and bishop to b8 isn't the best try. He needed to push his pawn to d4 to fight for space and create counterplay. This allows White to improve his position easily. And here comes another brilliant move from Duda, king to f2. It looks so quiet, but it's a killer prophylactic move that secures his king once and for all. The point is this: if Black tries bishop to a7, the rook swings over to g1. If the pawn pushes to d4, White simply takes it, and all of Black's threats have vanished. Pragg decides to capture with bishop takes bishop on g3, check, but this actually helps White. A more resilient defense was bishop to d6, keeping the pieces on. After bishop to f1, Black can push the pawn to d4. The pawns come off, and Black is still fighting, but after the move in the game, bishop takes bishop on g3 with check. White's path to victory becomes much clearer. Duda makes the great recapture, pawn takes bishop on g3. This is the only winning move, opening up files for his own attack. Pragg tries one last desperate attack. The rook swings to h5, the white rook comes to g1, and black gives a final check on h2. And Duda is a machine. Rook to g2 is the only move that wins, perfectly defending against all threats and cementing his control. The rook slides to h1, but Duda is in cleanup mode. He snags the d5 pawn with his queen, repositions his knight, while Pragg lays one final subtle trap. Duda plays queen takes pawn on c5, a slight inaccuracy. Stronger was rook to g1, keeping everything under lock and key. This gives black a glimmer of hope, but Pragg misses it. Queen to e6 is played, but the best chance was bishop takes the rook on g2, forcing an exchange and creating serious drawing chances. And another slip from Duda with queen to d5. Winning was complicated, but the most clinical move was bishop to c4, which would have ended the game much more quickly. The queens dance around the board, probing for weaknesses. Duda finally brings his bishop to c4, and Pragg is forced to trade his dangerous bishop for the rook on g2. White's queen gives a check on e8, and Pragg finds the only move. King to g7 is an excellent defense, the one way to keep the game alive. And here's why it works. If the queen checks on e5, the king simply steps to h7. After white takes the bishop on g2, black's rook can activate on b1, and there's still play. Duda's king takes the bishop on g2, as expected, and here it is, the final decisive mistake. In a terribly difficult position, this move loses on the spot. The only way to hold on was the incredible rook to b1. After queen to e5 check, king to g8, pawn to f4, the rook can take the pawn on b2 with check, and black is miraculously still in the game. But instead, Pragg plays rook to e1, and this walks right into a winning shot. And Duda finds it. Knight to f5 check. That's the game winner and the only one. After the pawn is forced to take the knight, the queen will take the rook on e1, and black's position completely collapses. And in this completely lost position, Praggnanandhaa resigns. A spectacular, hard-fought tactical battle, and it's Jan Krzysztof Duda who takes home the point. What a game.